Well, I live in Cambridge town. Right.
Yes, so my dad was running Elstree Film Studios from 1974 to 1990. He'd had a long association with the studios before that because he came in as basically a trainee executive in about 1955, I think, or 56. And he essentially became an associate producer, an executive producer, worked on various things. The Rebel with Tony Hancock. He was sort of completion guarantor, but he was definitely still with ABPC then. And the Cliff Richard movies, he was involved in those as associate producer, I think. So he had, as I say, a long-standing relationship. When the studios was taken over, I think in 1968, by EMI, I think that's when, or 69, it was effectively all change, and EMI came in, and he left the organisation at that point and became a freelance producer. And he had a slightly torturous relationship with Fred Zinnemann in the sense that he was called back 3 times to make films that never happened with Fred Zinnemann, which was very unfortunate for him. The most significant one, I would say, would be Man's Fate, because that was the one that was most, it was practically about to start the principal photography when the whole thing essentially fell to pieces because Kurt Kerkorian pulled the plug on it and MGM was taken over. And so that was a difficult period, and I think my dad didn't like being a freelancer very much. He wasn't, it wasn't in his blood to have that kind of instability. So he was brought in, I'm not entirely sure who was responsible, but he was brought in to become the managing director of Elstree in 1974, replacing Ian Scott, who was the managing director in between Brian Forbes and my father. And effectively he was brought in to close the studios, unbeknownst to him. When he was asked to be managing director, essentially the plan was to close the film studios, and he was essentially there to be the hatchet man. But you know, they sort of chose perhaps the wrong person in that sense, because it wasn't in my dad's vista at all to do this, because he loved the film studios, and he was fortunate in that he had one ally on the board of EMI called John Reed, who was significant in assisting him in creating a rescue plan. Also Alan Sapper, who was very important because he was the head of ACTT, which was the union that basically organised all the cameramen and well, pretty much all the film workers essentially. So between these 3, they managed to kind of create a rescue plan. But essentially it was a very, initially quite a fraught period, because my father had to basically lay off most of the staff that were at the studios at the time. And that might seem terribly kind of brutal, but I think people need to remember that at that particular period in the film industry, it was undergoing some monumental changes. There were far more films being shot on location, and one of the reasons the studios had problems was because it wasn't effectively a facility that was being used all the time. I mean, in the old days with ABPC, you had movies that were effectively all shot on stages from the beginning of the picture up more or less to the end. Moby Dick's a good example of that, and there used to be the tank, which I don't think is here anymore, but there used to be the tank, which was used for a lot of films, but they used that for some of Moby Dick. So because of this, my father had to basically come up with a plan which was agreed with the unions through Alan Sapper and John Reed to essentially lay off essentially most of the staff, which were the plasterers, editors, cameramen, carpenters, basically all the people who would have essentially been involved in making films, but who are now hired in on a sort of a freelance basis. And it was a very difficult time for my father. It certainly put some strain on my mother and father's relationship at the time, because it was just a very horrible time for my dad. He had people in his office crying who'd been with the studios, you know, from year dot, who essentially all got hired back as freelancers. So it wasn't it was a desperate plan to keep the studios open. And Bernie Delfont, who was sort of, I think, the main cheese at EMI at that time, sort of more or less said, well, if you can make a profit out of the studios, then I'll give you a box of Cuban cigars or some such thing. And apparently a year later, or 2 years later, there was this, he sort of rather in a recalcitrant fashion sort of slid a box of cigars across to my father, because they had turned the studios around and it became profit making. Probably one of the first pictures that was made during the time when my dad became managing director was Murder on the Orient Express, which is an EMI film, but that was very successful, so that helped give the studios a little bit of luster. And there were a few other things. There were the Confessions movies, which are not necessarily particularly auspicious, but you know, everything helped. The Virgin Soldiers movie, and I'm not sure, but I think possibly Julia and Valentino may have been made maybe before or just around the time of Star Wars, but there were essentially it was a bit slow going. Unquestionably, when George Lucas became associated with the studios, that's really when the future of the studios changed, and it became, you know, significantly more successful. The way my father told me the whole situation happened was that Gary Kurtz and George Lucas had gone to Pinewood, and the head of Pinewood at that time was not particularly bothered one way or the other whether he had Star Wars there. The impression I get is that it was just another film. If they had the money, great, but it seems like they came away not wholly feeling that it was a sympathetic environment. And the reason they needed a sympathetic environment was they were running out of money. I mean, Star Wars at the beginning of its, at that juncture, was having problems. George Lucas was having some difficulties with 20th Century Fox, and there was a little bit of, you know, a suggestion that they might stop financing the movie. So when they came to Elstree, essentially Dad wanted the film studios full, and he wanted that film because it was going to use a lot of the stages, and he agreed a pretty favourable rate and offered every amenity that he possibly could.
Both George Lucas and I felt that we wanted to see a space adventure movie in the tradition of Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers. That there hadn't been one in a long time, and it was just seemed like a good idea for a project. The next step was figuring out whether it was economically feasible to do it, whether we could get the special effects technicians, whether we could find enough stage space, whether we could convince a studio that that type of project was really worthwhile. And it took a long time to do that because everyone was very skeptical. The science fiction films had not made money in the recent past.
And he'd heard that both Gary Kurtz and George Lucas didn't drink. So my father certainly did like drinking, but I mean, I'm not saying he's an alcoholic, but he liked booze, but he didn't drink during that meeting because he was so keen to win them over as clients. He kind of made a pretense that he was somehow not remotely, so it was all Perrier or whatever was the beverage of choice. But essentially, that's how it came to the studios, and essentially it was partly my dad's desperate desire to have the studios full, and it was also his willingness to do, to basically rent the studios at quite a lot less than, say, the counterparts, the alternative locations in this country, i.e. Pinewood and Shepperton and so on. But George Lucas is a very kind of loyal person, I think, from my sort of observation. And once he made Star Wars here, he came back and decided to do pretty much all of his films here, which led on to obviously the follow-up Star Wars movies, which after the first one had been such a huge success. But my father, when he was negotiating with Lucas, Lucas showed him the script to sort of persuade him, to, I suppose, give a good deal or whatever. And all my dad said is, well, it's impossible to know what kind of a movie this is going to be, because it would just be pages and pages of empty spaces saying effects here, because this kind of thing was still relatively new. I mean, there had been movies like 2001 and that kind of thing, but there'd never been anything quite so definitively effects bound, where that became very much a part of the storytelling, I think, in a way that maybe a lot of other films hadn't had that as the narrative structure, as part of it.
Principal photography of this new myth may have started in a remote corner of North Africa, but Star Wars found its real home at Elstree, a rather ordinary suburb of North London.
It was just good news that somebody was coming into Elstree and to fill the stages up, and it meant work for the crews, and it meant work and money for the studio. I personally, and I think a lot of others at the time, did not have much faith in that as a project. I think people felt that sci-fi films were as dead at the box office as were westerns and musicals. And so when you saw this concept of little robots and furry creatures and a fairly unknown cast, except for Alec and Peter Cushing, you began to think, well, really, this is all a bit of a waste of time.
I don't really remember, I have to confess, very much about the shooting of the first Star Wars, because that would be about 1976 they were making it, I guess, so I would have been 7, and to be honest, it wasn't paramount in my mind, because I didn't know what it was. We used to walk around the studios every weekend, but I didn't really see very much of the shooting of that. However, I think I must have walked on some of the sets, although my memory of that's a bit vague.
Ready? Here we go.
Take 559, take 4. Take a few minutes for the Navi computer to calculate the coordinates.
A few minutes? Are you kidding? At the rate they're gaining?
No, what is it? You have to shoot this. Traveling through hyperspace is like dusting crops, kid. Without precise calculations, we fly too close to a store, or bounce into a supermarket, and then...
Yeah.
Be a hell of a
What's
mess.
that?
Watch. You're losing your deflector shields. Go strap yourselves in. Be careful on the way out.
Yeah, sure. I'm taking it very cautiously.
You go away.
Sounds too near a supermarket?
Right. Turn over. Running.
First line is watch your mouth, kid.
No, first line is...
559, take one.
Didn't you? Isn't it?
Yeah.
See?
Action! Can't you outrun him? I thought you said this thing was fast.
Watch your mouth, kid. You're gonna find yourself floating home. We'll be safe enough once we reach hyperspace. Besides, I know a few maneuvers. I'll lose them.
Okay, cut. Action! Can't you outrun him? I thought you said this thing was fast.
Watch your mouth, kid. You're gonna find yourself floating home. We'll be safe enough once we make the jump to hyperspace. Besides, I know a few maneuvers. We'll lose them. The fun begins.
Okay, cut.
All right.
Okay, print that.
So the next section.
My first experience of it was when the film Star Wars was when we actually watched it. Dad used to organise this thing where they would run films every Friday night, or maybe once a month, or I'm not really quite sure, but he would get prints of different movies, and this was a tradition that ran up right more or less until he left, as far as I can remember. But the Star Wars was one of those pictures that we saw before it did. I think it was before the cruise screening, actually, as far as I can remember. And so we saw that in the dubbing theatre, and there'd usually be about 20 or 30 people there.
Droid on the scanner. Dead ahead. Might be our little R2 unit. Hit the accelerator.
I've got vague memories of that, but I do remember when I went to see... I remember when we went to the cruise screening, it was... there was a real buzz in the air. It hadn't been released. They used to hire out, you know, somewhere like the Odeon Leicester Square, and they used to be at about 11 o'clock in the morning or something like that. But I remember the huge queue around the block, and then we went into the theatre and we watched this movie, and it was just the most, it was an extraordinary thing. And I remember the very first shot with the spaceship coming into view, which is a very famous moment. That was, and the sound that was lifting you off the seat, and it was just the most extraordinary moment. And cruise screenings were always they were always good fun, because essentially it was a family affair. It was always people who were involved in making the movie, plus friends, people who got invites. I mean, they were always very enjoyable. And I think there were quite a few kids there, because they would have been, as I say, related to the people who actually made the movie. But, at the end of the movie, you'd have the credits, which I think Star Wars was one of the first movies where the credits just seemed to go on almost as long as the movie. And, it just seemed to be an endless succession of names. But when you went to the cruise screening, that was quite fun, because people would see their name and then people would applaud themselves, or people would applaud them, or whatever. And it was a very enjoyable kind of way to see films, and it was a very exciting time. It certainly was that. There's no question, when I saw Star Wars, even though I don't think I was kind of a #1 fan, there's no question you knew you'd seen something that was not like any other movie that had been around, certainly before then. And I think my dad felt that definitely as well.
The attendance at Star Wars has been almost astronomical. Queues are still forming. In America, more money was taken at box offices in 1 week than for the prestigious Jaws. In London, after a month, almost 600,000 flocked to see the film, an all-time record. What is the attraction of Star Wars? Who can say? There have been lavish spectaculars before. Perhaps it's because this one takes the best from all the rest. Colour, breathless excitement, fantasy. And because we on this planet are already touching space with a tentative finger, more reality than we care to admit.
But yeah, I remember that first movie was quite incredible. And we went to a sort of garden party before I saw the movie. And at that party there was, you know, Anthony Daniels and Carrie Fisher and Mark Hamill. I don't think Harrison Ford was there. I think David Prowse was there. So I remember going to this party, and the thing was, because I didn't know who any of these people were, because I hadn't seen the film, I didn't know anything about these people. They were just sort of random people, and you sort of knew they were actors and things, but that was it. And I remember at that time, ironically, the most famous person there was Jimmy Hill, who is a sports commentator of not any particular note, but everyone at that time would have known who he was in this country because he was on TV every Saturday. And although I didn't like football or whatever it was, I knew who he was. So I always found that very ironic that the only person I recognised at that particular party, I seem to remember, was Jimmy Hill, and I didn't know who any of these people were. Of course, after I'd seen the film, it was very apparent. I saw the movie probably not that long after it had been completed, because certainly when I discovered this little item in this box here, that was not, I mean, there was still tons of stuff left over from Star Wars that had just been junked. In those days, well, in fact, I mean, it's possibly the same today, I don't know, but in those days, because of the way Elstree was, there would be bits of props left, and they would just sit there forever, and to some extent I think my dad rather liked this because it gave the studios a bit of a, you know, character. I mean, for instance, I was trying to discover yesterday whether Tommy had ever been shot here, because I know that Ken Russell had associations, he'd done Valentino and so on, but for some reason, I don't think it was ever shot here, but we had the boots that Elton John was standing on doing Pinball Wizard, which were these ridiculously huge, enormous kind of plaster boots that he was standing on when he was shooting that kind of DM things. And they were tucked away in a corner somewhere. It was a World War II bomber, which was here for some reason, possibly left over from Dam Busters. I really don't know, but I remember playing in it with my friend Richard. And as I say, so Star Wars left bits and pieces left over, a bit of a land speeder, some bit of some space cockpit or something. And I happened to be walking around with my father not long after the film had wrapped. And I sort of spied, I suppose there'd been lots of bits left over and we were looking around anyway. I spied this thing, which I realised was a lightsaber, and it was I recognised it, but thought it was a very unimpressive looking object, if I'm being honest. But yeah, it's I said, I'm sure that's a lightsaber, and my dad said yes, possibly. It was covered in mud, it had been discarded, it was obviously dropped or something had happened to it, so it wasn't, it didn't look like anybody had any use for it, and it was covered in, as I said, it had just been thrown away. So I said, well, can I take it? And he said, you may as well, because it's not, doesn't seem to kind of belong to anybody anymore, so that's why it sort of ended up in my possession. And that sort of sat on my shelf for years and years and years, and I did keep it because it was part of Star Wars, but I can't say I ever pretended I was Luke Skywalker or anything. It was just, I think maybe because I was very privileged to have been closely observing all of this sort of filmmaking and so on, it to some extent didn't have quite the same impact on me that maybe it does to people who weren't that close to the actual filming of it. But yeah, it sat on my shelf for a long time until I decided I'd give it to somebody who was completely Star Wars potty, and it was his 18th birthday, I think, so I thought, well, I'll give him that as a birthday present, because at that time it had sort of ceased to be particularly something that was, I was getting into doing music and so on at that point, and I was perhaps not, I was still interested in film, but I don't think, certainly things like Star Wars were not paramount in my sort of psyche at that time. So, and I did the same thing with the Star Wars gun, which had actually been given to me, but that was from the props department. They had made loads of them. But apparently, from what I've just been told, it was discarded, which I wouldn't have been quite so cavalier as throwing it away, but I gave that to somebody or other. Again, I must have done it as a birthday present or something. I had various, I mean, as I say, there were, can I put this down? There were various props and things that we used to have. We had a thing from, or several of these sort of strange latex things from Space Vampires, which was a terrible movie by Tobe Hooper. I can say that because he's made good movies, but that was not a particularly good movie.
How many live people are here? 2? Okay, good.
And but these things were they were quite scary looking, and they were made of latex, and I suppose they were the victims of the space vampires because they were drained of blood and and I used to hang them in trees and things at Halloween and stuff like that. There was the best thing though, I think, from that kind of period in terms of props getting utility out of them was my dad took a load of these things from Dark Crystal, which was the Jim Henson movie, which I think Gary Kurtz produced actually, and they had lots of these funny little things where they'd have a little kind of straw thing that would pop out a feathery object, and kind of weird looking mushrooms and all these kind of odd looking strange plants, because at one point in the movie you see they shoot seeing all these weird little things. Anyway, my dad thought it would be very funny to plant them in his front garden, in the front garden of the house at in Wood Street, and he got endless amounts of fun watching people being absolutely fascinated because they'd see these things and they'd think they were real plants, and they'd be going, oh, look at that, I've never seen anything like that before. And obviously they were fake, but they look kind of quite good. So those are the kind of things we used to, we had the advantage of doing that because of the sheer volume of these things. There were quite a lot. I presume there must have been a fair number of lightsabers, otherwise that one wouldn't have just been thrown away. But as I say, that was the way it was kind of recovered. So The Shining was that was an interesting period here, because Kubrick, great man as he was somewhat driven and somewhat kind of, he had his objectives and really didn't have too much consideration about what was the effect. And I just remember The Shining was a very, very long shoot for a start. It ran over schedule quite badly, so much so that my dad had to move stuff that was supposed to come into the studios. I'm not quite sure what film it was, but something had to be, I think he had to pass it on to Shepperton or something. And I know that happened as well with the dubbing of Barry Lyndon, actually. I think with Barry Lyndon, my dad had to shift clients that were supposed to go into to see Billy Rowe and dubbing, because it went on and on and on. That tended to be a case with Kubrick, that he would not be too anxious over schedules, it seems. But certainly The Shining was a long shoot. They did an enormous amount of it here. I mean, it was quite extraordinary. You had the actual facade of the hotel out on the back lot, and really, like a lot of the things that they designed here, when they did that, it just looked absolutely amazing. One thing I remember was that there was a real problem because real snow happened, and there was lots of fake snow, and real snow don't mix terribly well.
Tell them to reduce the snow.
Alan, stand over here! Alan! Alan, reduce the snow a bit, Al.
You can't even hear us. Reduce the snow. They can hear you.
I think that produced a few problems initially at one stage, because it would have been around 1978, I think, or 78, I think is when we shot. But I mean, it went on right through, it carried on, I think, all year maybe, or certainly it was about at least half a year it was shot here. There was also, I mean, there were various things, not that it was particularly salient, but the blood sequence, the way they did that was that they used the reservoir, which is now part of Tesco's, I think, or a housing estate or something. They used the reservoir to make the blood, and they poured a load of red dye for that sequence when it goes gushing through the hotel lobby. And Dad was quite annoyed because it killed all the fish, that there were actual fish in there, and they were all basically murdered by pouring in this horrible red dye. There was the fire. I remember again my dad got a phone call late at night to be told that stage 3, or is it? Okay. Yeah, was on fire, and I think that was a very sort of stressful moment for my father, because he thought, oh my God, you know, after having actually resurrected the studio in terms of actually getting it off the ground again, he thought it's all over, because you didn't know obviously how far and wide that fire was going to go. But fortunately it didn't decimate the studios, it was only that stage. But that obviously must have put the filming back a bit, to be fair to Kubrick. That wasn't his fault that that happened. I know that that I actually remember meeting Jack Nicholson, actually, and he used to go up to my dad's office to have a drink because he felt like he was held captive. I know that Tom Cruise once said this about when they did Eyes Wide Shut. He was quoted in an interview saying he didn't realise he was going to be there making it for the rest of his life or something. And I think certainly Jack Nicholson felt a bit like he'd been taken hostage.
It's 8 o'clock. Why are we starting now? Is he crazy?
They're trying to finish it, Jack, for the week.
Well, let's get him finished. Let's get him out of here. Huh? Finished with the assignment. Beautiful. Excellent work. Great work.
He got on quite well with my dad, and he brought his Western, his comedy Western, they dubbed that, I think, at Elstree. I remember there just used to be a big poster saying something about he was too bad for hanging, so they made him marry her, or something terribly not particularly appropriate for the Me Too era that we're living in now, but I seem to remember that was the byline of the poster. Anyway, but yeah, Jack Nicholson, I remember, was quite imposing, and I met Kubrick, in fact. He met my mum quite a lot as well, and he got on very well with her, but I was so young at the time, and these were just sort of huge. I don't mean in terms of height, but they were just, there was a charisma definitely these people had, so I tended not to say anything. I mean, one thing that my father kind of instilled both in myself and my sister was not to in any way try and be precocious or try to push ourselves forward in any way. We were always given very much the clear idea this is a working environment. Although we had quite a lot of free rein to go on sets and things, it was under the proviso that you behaved yourself and you didn't draw attention to yourself, and you just, you know, didn't in any way impede the progress of whatever someone was doing. And so obviously, as I say, I saw these people and was introduced to them briefly, but they were not people I obviously had conversations with until that didn't happen until later on, maybe. With the exception of Harrison Ford, whom I met doing the Peter Hyams movie, Hanover Street, and I met him because obviously I'd seen Star Wars, and so by that point I was enough of a fan that this was quite an exciting thing to meet him. And he was, I think, he was very lovely and friendly because maybe he was a bit lonely. He was stuck in this trailer, but he made a lot of fuss of me and was very nice to me. And over the years, I used to see him from time to time when he was doing the different movies that he'd made there. Obviously, towards the end, the relationship had not exactly fractured, but there was some distance between that little kid that was a fan and a sort of grown-up person. By 1990, I was 20, so by that point it was a bit different. So but as I say, I remember meeting him when he was doing that film, and he was very sweet. And as I say, I'd met him from time to time and got the the obligatory picture with a nice quote on it from him and so on. But yeah, the Shining, going back to that, was a very, again, exciting sort of time because they used so much of the studio. So I remember going into the ballroom, which I think is the set that was burnt down. So it's possible it got burnt down after they'd done the main shooting there. I'm not sure, because I don't think they reconstructed that set again.
Okay, right, let's have a big clearance in the set then, please. Okay, number one. Only people who should be there.
Les has to bring him in.
The way we went when he was... Yeah. We've got to do his hand and all that. We've got to do his hand.
Do it right now. Come on. Get him in. Let anybody do it, Brian. Just get him in and let him realize we're out of time.
I remember the maze particularly because I stuck a poppy in one of the where the maze was, and as far as I know, I think that ended up. I mean, probably you can't see it, but I think it was in there when they were actually shooting it, because I didn't tell anybody, but I sort of stuck a little poppy actually in. So that it obviously was around November that time, because that would have been remembrance period. But it was, as I say, a very interesting time, and not the easiest time for my dad because Kubrick was fairly demanding. I have an interview with him which he did for the BFI, where Dad was talking about the fact that Kubrick was challenging him on how much money he was being charged for electricity. And my dad kind of well, he listened to him, obviously, and thought, that's ridiculous. And then he went back and he got it calculated, and he said, yeah, actually, he had been charging him too much for electricity. But that was the kind of mind that Kubrick had, very sort of obsessive about detail. Maybe he was on the spectrum or something, because it's the kind of thing that most people don't sit there actually analysing pennies when you're spending millions on movies. I know that my mum met Shelley Duvall at a premiere for Popeye, the much berated Altman movie, and she went to the premiere with my father, and Shelley Duvall was playing Olive Oil, and my mum was sitting next to her at some point in the proceedings, and she said, she was very impressed with how that must have been a very difficult part. I think my mum said, playing somebody with rubbery arms and legs and things, and Shelley Duvall said it was nothing like as difficult as working with Kubrick.
Here's Johnny!
It was a very difficult role. It was a long shoot, and I had to cry and hyperventilate and carry a little boy and run, for most of the time we shot. And that was about a year, a little over a year.
Because Kubrick had practically having a nervous breakdown. She was, I think, going through quite a tough time in her personal life, and Kubrick was not sympathetic at all.
Cut it. Keep it rolling.
Keep the video rolling.
Keep video rolling.
Reduce the smoke a little, Alan.
Reduce the smoke a little bit, Al.
Okay, turn over.
Okay, turn over. Roll video and action, Shelley.
Action, Shelley! Cut it.
Nobody even said roll
There's
video.
no desperation. Oh, come on. What do you mean roll
2
video?
seconds.
We're fucking killing ourselves out here, and you've got to be ready.
I am too. I'm standing
So we
right
play
by
mood
the
music?
door. No, I
Yeah,
can't
but when
hear.
you came in like this, you should have just...
We're sitting there because they say, wait a minute,
okay.
and then you say
Yeah,
on the radio,
but when you
go.
do it, you've got to look desperate, Shelley. You're just wasting everybody's time now.
I can't even get
Well,
this
push
freaking
it
door
against
open.
it.
You have... On the record, I got such a bollocking because they said, turn over, and they said, video rolling and all that, and I got all ready, and jumped up and down, and then they said, never mind, cut it. And then I went to take a bite of soup. The next thing I know, action, Shelley. So.
The salient thing about Empire Strikes Back, which was stage 6, which had been effectively created, I think, essentially for that film, which at that time was the largest soundstage in the UK. And that was there was a funny sort of deal that had been done with EMI and Lucas. Once he decided that this was his studio of choice, he got into a sort of rather weird financing deal to have that studio built. So the reason that a stage rather built. So stage 6 was sort of, there was a kind of an odd financing deal where Lucas came in on the financing of building it, primarily because he wanted to use it on, you know, the Star Wars movies and also the Raiders things as they later became into production. I think they shot a fair amount of the ice stuff, at least the Rebels base or whatever it was. I think they shot that on Studio 6. We used to walk, as I say, around the studios every weekend. So obviously, quite a lot of the time there was no filming at that particular point. So you could just walk on and just see these incredible sets.
This is the best. Chewie.
You can't say right to left yet.
Last Chewie. Okay. Okay. He says good luck. Briefing. Let's go. Okay. All right. Oh. There.
Kurt?
Yeah.
You want to just run this down?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Hey.
Hey.
Here.
Hi. Oh, when you got one of them, trust you, they've all gone home.
She.
I mean, there were other films going on like Flash Gordon, if anybody can remember that, which was a rather wonderful kitsch piece of 1980s science fiction. And what was interesting with that one was I remember walking onto a set which never got used, or rather they didn't use the whatever they shot there. It was a huge set with millions of skulls and a huge spider kind of thing, and it never made it into the film. So it's always interesting when you went onto kind of sets where for some reason or another it ended up on the cutting room floor.
Just a man with a man's courage. You know he's nothing but a man. He can never fail. No
And as I say, Lucas had, I've seemingly decided, I suppose, that he was going to use Elstree for most of his filming at that point. He was then going to make Raiders of the Lost Ark, which obviously was another blockbuster movie.
First picture I had ever directed in the UK. And I assumed we would go to the most famous studio there, Pinewood. But George has a good luck theory about all of his Star Wars films having been shot at Elstree in England. So I went ahead and looked at the stages, and they were pretty big.
But the interesting story about that really was that there was a kind of a contractual deal, because he wanted to use Spielberg as the director for Raiders, and at that particular point Spielberg's standing was not as high as we now consider it to be, because he'd made this movie that was disastrous called 1941. It's incredible to think we're not overly keen on having Spielberg direct the movie, and if I recall correctly, the agreement was that if it went one day over schedule, Lucas had to come back in and start directing it himself.
I want one person whose job it is only to keep the pythons away from engaging the actors.
Let's reconsider this whole thing.
Oh yeah, I know what we should do. When we get to the next skeleton, that's a good idea. That's a great idea. Wait a second, that's terrific.
And I think that if I remember correctly, my father was trying to get Barry Spikings, who was, I think it was Thorn EMI by then, or EMI, I'm not quite sure, to finance Raiders. But that would have changed everything, and it would have altered, I think, the future of the studios completely. But one thing I remember was a friend of mine called John Falcini. He and I were wandering around here during the summer when the second Raiders movie was being made, and they were shooting a sequence for the second Raiders, which was the one shot in the Chinese cafe or whatever it is, the huge restaurant or whatever. And it was a very, very hot day. My memory of it was absolutely boiling. There was a kind of a mischievous mood with everybody on that day when they were shooting, and there were water balloons being dropped from the gallery and all that sort of thing. So it's that kind of... So it was quite a relaxed atmosphere.
Great screen. Ready? Here it goes. On three. You count to three.
1, 2, 3.
Now, they'll whip me later. They'll be a great scream. It'll be a great scream. Put your Bay Rage and King Kong. That's the best thing I've ever heard.
And we sort of snuck on. And as I say, I always made a point of, you know, we were tucked in the back and we didn't... What would happen is you'd just sort of see that the door was opening and just sort of sneak through. But I think some people did know there were a couple of interlopers, because there was a sequence where they have these people coming out with machine guns and they go blah 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 blah, and obviously they were using blanks. But the thing about blanks that maybe people don't know is that they do fire real, the cartridges do actually get expended. And all I remember was that everybody managed to move out the way except for myself and John, who was sort of tucked in the back, and suddenly we got showered by burning hot metal cartridges that came flying from nowhere, because we didn't know what was happening in this sequence. I'm not sure, but I think that was possibly done deliberately, not in a way of causing any harm, but obviously people were in a kind of silly mood. At that point at Elstree, it was a wonderful period, because the kind of the dark period of the early 70s when my dad took over was pretty much gone. You had all these blockbusters being made, later on things like you know, Roger Rabbit, but that was a bit later, and it was, you know, it was an era when certainly studios were in its highest period, and it was a very, very kind of happy kind of environment. Obviously, the period that came after that was when effectively the studios were being sold, and Thorny and I, as I say, initially sold it to this Australian kind of financier called Bond, Alan Bond, I think his name was. But he never had any great interest in keeping the studios, and literally, I think within the space of 2 weeks or something, or even may even have been shorter, I can't really remember, he'd sold it to the Golan brothers. Now, they were interesting. They weren't, I think one of them was more charming than the other, and I couldn't tell you which was which, because actually one was really into films and one wasn't, I think is the primary thing. So my dad quite liked the guy that was into films, but not dreadfully keen on the one that wasn't, who was quite brusque and not terribly charming. There was a little bit of a cultural difference as well. Israelis can come across as maybe being a bit brusque and so on, because it's just a whole different way of doing business, where yelling is a perfectly reasonable way of kind of conducting yourself in a meeting and that sort of thing.
Jack, we are talking about the director, Bogdanovich. I want to sign with Bogdanovich a 2 or 3 picture deal.
Yeah, but you know, Mark, I'm going to tell you something, all right? I mean, you and I know each other a long time. But if you want to buy Peter Bogdanovich on the street, okay? Just say that you had a project called XYZ.
Yeah, I'm not buying people. I'm giving them opportunities.
But he's not going to do it for $1 million, honestly, guys.
Yeah. Then we don't have a deal.
I mean, that's what I got to tell you honestly. I don't want to. I do respect you, all right?
My friend, my offer to him is $1 million per picture with points, fair points, and to be a member of the Cannon family. He needs a family because he's now without a family. And he's a loser, and he needs to be with the winners.
Live in the streets, you got to be careful of everyone you meet. There's looting and shooting, people stabbing, the innocent bystander.
Cannon, who already own the classic and star cinema chains in Britain, have been interested in buying screen entertainment all along. Under today's deal, Cannon has pledged to step up film production at Elstree Studios. The combined group will control almost 40% of the cinema screens in this country, a share of the market that could well attract the attentions of the Office of Fair Trading.
The company doesn't have any problem to finance this acquisition, and don't need any help from nobody.
Do you think this is the end of Cannon's outward expansion now, or are you still intending to acquire more?
It's not the sky's the limit. It's not. Why should it be the end?
They came in with honourable intentions. I think they genuinely wanted to make big films, and they wanted the studios to be their base. I think all one can say about them really was that they just they were good at making these sort of cheap movies like Lemon Popsicle and Death Wish, and in some senses they had tapped into a market that was quite effective, where when it went to ancillary sales of video and so on, that made the movies viable. When they started getting into big pictures, it became problematic, and I think not least because I don't think the film industry as a whole, the kind of the main Hollywood kind of industry, liked these interlopers coming in to some extent. They certainly, there was a bit of almost an attitude of what happened to Laker with his aircraft back in the 70s. There seemed to be some hostility towards the Golan brothers. I can't say that I think they were the most artistically brilliant people, but they definitely were not helped. And I remember with Superman 4, that film was very much, it perhaps wasn't a great movie anyway. It was the fourth in that particular franchise, but it was cut to pieces, and not at their behest. It was the executives involved in financing that film ripped that movie apart and turned it into something that was really unwatchable.
Half an hour later, almost midnight, Christopher Reeve's calling me. What am I doing? I'm ruining the big... Look, Chris is the star of the movie. He should act in the movie. He can work on the script with the writer. I did everything they wanted. I sent the writer to New York. I did everything they wanted. His interference, that we have a kind of an axe over our head from a star, I don't like it. Honestly to God, I don't like it. We are doing this movie, and he said, you know what he said to me, and that I thought is a kind of a way which I wouldn't like to hear it from nobody. He said, if you don't have another $1.5 million to do this movie in New York, how do I know that you have 30 million to do Superman? I mean, the way to talk to me like that, where do you take the money, he said. I said, from the bank, Chris, from the bank. You don't understand in the world realities. What can I tell him, that he's only worth $1 in Superman? Can I tell him that and I will be a guy who insults him? I did Street Smart because I wanted to please him, because I like the script, because I think it's a good project for us. But if we go bananas with the budget there, we will risk our ass. We don't work this way.
Christopher Reeve returns as Superman in Superman 4, his biggest adventure yet.
Ultimately, they just ran out of money, and the thing that happened with that was that they basically bought the studios perhaps for more than it was worth realistically. Certainly, by the time they got through with it, they'd sold the Pathé library, which was a gold mine for the studios, and it was a great mistake to get rid of it because it was a real asset that at the time made the studios viable. As I say, they bought it for too much money, so when they sold it to Brent Walker, as an asset, it just didn't have the same value in terms of a book value that it might have done, say, before the studios had been taken over all these many times.
I was under the impression, I had been told, that the Canon people, Globus and Golan, had promised never to sell the studio for real estate and land development, and I took them to their word, and felt very secure that I would have a very, very long and secure run here in the UK making movies at this studio. So it comes as a great personal disappointment, and I'm a bit ashamed of the Canon people for selling out to a big business profit and all the commercial concerns.
It was the Golan Brothers takeover was very difficult for my dad, and in fact it was so difficult that he ended up having a heart attack. It wasn't a tremendously serious one, but it certainly was serious enough that I think it stopped and made him think. When the studios got taken over again, I think he wasn't perhaps as prepared to go the distance to fight, because I think he'd been through this now 4 times and he was exhausted, and he was 65 then. I just think especially because Brent Walker was a very unsympathetic organisation, and they had no intention of running the film studios as an actual facility. They had only really one intention, which is to close it. But certainly, as I say, when the Golan Brothers came in, I think they did have, they had good intentions, but their style was not particularly easy, and they were not successful in their ambitions, and that's what led ultimately to them having to sell the studios. And ultimately, as I said, when Brent Walker came in, it was most definitely the case that there was very little commitment to keeping the studios open. I mean, my father One thing I would say is he was very upset with the fact that at the time there was these media reports going around by very ill-informed journalists saying, oh, well, the studios just aren't viable anymore. And it's like, what was happening here was that he was being told that he could not rent the facility for any longer period than, say, about a month or something along those lines, maybe a month, 6 weeks. It was not long enough for any film company to come in, unless it was a very small budget thing, and come in and make their movies. So what would happen would be that the studios just simply, and also there was no definitive time as to, or definitive fate at that time as to what was going to happen to the studios. So filmmakers, understandably, didn't want to come into an environment where they might end up having to shut down their entire operation because suddenly Brent Walker wanted to do something untoward like close the studios down or whatever, and it became impossible for the facility to be rented effectively. So the only things that were done at that time were television and adverts and short run type engagements which didn't require, you know, any sort of long-term commitment from the studios to be able to operate as a facility and let filmmakers get on with what they were needed to do. So it really was misleading when the media tried to report that the studios were not viable. They were not viable because effectively Brent Walker was deliberately trying to run the studios down in order to make a case to say, look, see, can't make any money, can we close it now and use it for the book value of the real estate? And that was fundamentally the ambition of George Walker.
This will be a big loss to this country and to our industry per se. I think that what's happened here is that part of our heritage has been taken away, and certainly a big chunk of our future, because a third of the stage space available in large studios will no longer exist. Therefore, there are 10 stages which can never be used again, and therefore, somewhere down the line, there are going to be a number of films that will not be able to shoot in this country as a result.
Filming will stop in October and 70 jobs will go. A property company are taking over the site, but it's not clear what they'll do with it. The fear is that this, the heart of the British film industry, could become a housing estate or even a supermarket, and that unlike a film script, it's unlikely to have a happy ending.
Fortunately for my dad, he didn't actually witness when all the studios, you know, so much of it was removed. I mean, it was essentially 26 acres, which then went down to 10. And the deal originally was that Brent Walker agreed that they would rebuild the dubbing theatre. I think that was part of the agreement with the initially, which was going to allow him to keep the studios open and keep 10 acres operating. But that meant that you lost 16 acres, which meant that you lost the back lot, you lost what was then the dubbing theatre, which had just, you know, been refurbished and new equipment had been put in and all the rest of it. You lost something like 6 stages, including the Star Wars stage. So it was quite a major, you know, it was quite a major clearing the facility and losing an awful lot of the amenity that the studios provided. So I say, fortunately for him, he never actually saw. I don't think he wanted to hang around and watch the studios being sort of broken up into bits. quite a large chunk of what existed during my father's time. The saddest thing for my father was that when the studios when it was recovered and it looked like it was going to be run as a proper facility as it is now, he was going to be brought in as a consultant, and it was rather an exciting period in terms of that, but he had developed cancer about 6 months before, and it was terminal. So rather sadly for him, he was too ill to be involved when the studios was finally sort of rescued. And unfortunately, although he'd been asked if he wanted to get involved as a consultant, it just wasn't possible, and he died a few months after that. So that was kind of, it wasn't for my father a particularly happy way to leave the studios. Certainly in 1990 it was a very, very depressed time. I remember we went to the last Christmas party and it was just grim, and he certainly didn't feel that he'd left with any sense of having sort of succeeded, which I think is a shame, because quite honestly people should remember that without both his efforts and, as I said, Alan Sapper and John Reed, the studios would never have got as far as it did at that point. So it wouldn't have remained open had it not been for those three key people. And I think it's fair to say my father was more instrumental than anybody, because he had an absolute undying commitment to the studios. It was basically, you know, his second wife, effectively. So the nice thing, of course, is we were invited back when they sort of repackaged the studios around the 1990s. I can't quite remember when. And then, of course, the proudest moment was that, although sadly Dad wasn't there to see it, my mother and my sister and I were invited to come to the opening of the Andrew Mitchell building, which certainly was a very great sort of privilege and acknowledgement as well to his commitment. And I think he would have been really touched that they did that. And I think it's a reasonable tribute to somebody whose real commitment to the studios. It certainly, as I understand now, is doing very well. Obviously it's not the full facility that it was when it was around in my dad's day, but to some extent with filmmaking now there is a different culture. So much stuff is CGI as well, and also television has become far more paramount. You know, in the end, as well, the studios are only as good as what's being filmed inside it. And you know, as I say, I think the studios is now facing a better future, which is wonderful. But certainly in the the early 90s, my dad's, it was a very kind of sad occasion for him, and at that time it didn't look like the studios were going to be preserved. So I'm, you know, very glad that people stood up for it, and I think it's, you know, Paul Welsh and people like that have to be given their due consideration, because they really tried, well, they succeeded in managing to campaign for it to be kept open. My dad used to say one thing, he used to say there was a sort of curse of Elstree, because all the people that came in to the studios or took it over, and to some extent were not necessarily that that easy to get on with. They all seem to fall foul after the event, and I don't think, I'm not saying my dad enjoyed Schadenfreude, but it was interesting to him that, you know, certain executives and stuff that caused him some grief sort of ended up falling foul. Certainly with the Golan brothers, although I don't think he would have wished them ill actually particularly, but they fell foul of this curse, and you know, so did Alan Bond actually, and so did George Walker. So it was a kind of a weird thing where, but I think that's possibly just because these financing agreements or these financing events tend to give an insight into the way those companies are run actually at the time. So as I say, but as I say, we're sitting here in Elstree now, and at least there's, you know, a marker for a great long period of filmmaking history in this country. And this is the oldest film studio, as far as I'm aware, in this country. I read, or somebody did a history of Britain on Radio 4 once, and they said Pinewood was the first Hollywood-style studio, and I felt like writing to them and saying, you're wrong actually, because Maxwell opened this before Pinewood back in 1927, and that was as much of a Hollywood-style studio as anywhere else. So I did feel like picking him up, but then I couldn't be bothered.